Okay, now we have the great pleasure to turn it over to Susan Chapnick and Marilyn Wade to talk about climate vulnerability. So Susan, I believe you have the ability to share your screen and you can show us how it's done.
Okie dokie. I am going to try. Just 1 second. From the beginning. Can everybody see my screen?
Well done.
Yes. Very nice. Thank you.
Yes? Okay, great. Okay. I'm going to start off and then transition to Marilyn Wade. Marilyn and I are members of the LSPA Climate Change Subcommittee. We'll be presenting assessing climate vulnerability at 21 East Side. Ken Mara of DEP is working with us on this subcommittee and helped with these slides. As well, he couldn't be here today. So he's here in spirit. Some of you may have seen a few of these slides. I had to put in some slides for context. Ken Mara did, I think, several presentations in January, excuse me, one at the LSPA meeting and one, I believe, at a weekly Bureau Wayside Cleanup meeting, updating the community on what the LSPA subcommittee is working on right now. So I have a few slides that might be a little bit of a review, but it'll tell you where we are at the time to set the framework. So the 2021 MCP amendments that Liz talked about, hopefully coming out in the fall, which when we first started this were the 2018 amendments, have in them requirements to assess climate change. And in response to that, the LSPA set up a subcommittee to draft guidance documents to help the LSPs address this new requirement. We have several drafts in progress. One is a Q&A, which Ken talked about in more detail back in January. And I believe, Paul, that those slides are available to everybody. I don't know if somebody can put the link in the chat, would be great. So if people didn't get to hear Ken's discussion, there are more details on some of these that Marilyn and I are not going to get to today. We also did a flow chart, which I'll briefly go over today. We have an extensive glossary of terms, which is about, I'd say, 85 to 95% completed. We have updated tools and resources. One silver lining to the fact that these amendments have not gotten through yet is that there are many more resources to choose from right now. Good resources and good technical resources, which Marilyn will go through at the end of this discussion. And we're going to focus on a vulnerability assessment checklist, which the subcommittee has drafted to assist going through how to assess vulnerability. And the final draft in progress that we have are case studies, a simple case study and a more complex case study to actually use the tools we've set up and see how that would work. In terms of where are the requirements in the MCP amendments to assess climate impacts, they're in the definition of the conceptual site model, in RAPS, Response Action Performance Standards, and in the definition of foreseeable period of time for a permanent solution. So I'm just going to show you a few slides just to highlight where the requirements are in the updated amendments. In 40.0006 in the conceptual site model, the routes of exposure to human and environmental receptors that provide a dynamic framework for assessing current and foreseeable future site characteristics. In 40.0191 in RAPS, no significant risk for any foreseeable period of time, as defined later in 310 CMR 40.1005. It also requires a consideration of relevant policies and guidelines issued by the department and EOEEA, and the use of accurate and up-to-date methods, models, standards, and practices. And we'll discuss, well, the models I actually previously Ken discussed. We're using resilientmass.org, resilientma.org as the source of the models for assessing vulnerability, exposure, and sensitivity. And here is the only place in the updated amendments that climate change is actually listed as a word, climate change. And that's in 40.1005, considering existing site conditions and reasonably foreseeable future changes in site conditions, including anticipated impacts associated with climate change. So there are the requirements that are going to be in the new regs that focus our assessment. This is the LSPA Climate Change Subcommittee. It's grown since Ken presented this in January to 23 members, plus occasional invited guests with specific areas of expertise. We welcome new members. The email is on the bottom there, and our next meeting is next Tuesday. I think we have that on the final slide. The Q&A has 11 questions, and I won't go through all of these because Ken did in January. However, we're going to focus on question number 4, which is how is vulnerability to climate impacts at 21E sites to be assessed? And that's what the committee has been focusing on for the last few weeks. The Q&A document is nearly complete and will be available with the rest of the guidance as we get the drafts out. You may have seen this from Ken's discussion. This is a flow chart of vulnerability. We define vulnerability in the glossary as the degree to which a system is susceptible to or the predisposition to be adversely affected by climate change impacts as a function of exposure and sensitivity, and also adaptive capacity. So the climate change considerations are from the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Action Plan, or commonly known as SHMCAP, which is kind of an awkward acronym, but there it is. There are 4 primary climate changes that are considered in SHMCAP, and the LSPA subcommittee adopted the same 4 climate change considerations. So you'll see that we've tried to be careful to use the same terminology and the same categories as other guidance in the Commonwealth, so that it's not confusing or competing, that we have competing terms and guidance. So these 4 areas include precipitation, sea level rise, temperature, and extreme weather. Sensitivity site characteristics include location, for example, near a sensitive area or wetland, demographics, urban, including environmental justice communities, equipment and structures, for example, if wells are on, monitoring wells are on site, etc. Regulatory status, whether the site is open, whether the site has an AUL, and contaminant type, fate, and transport. This is a screenshot from the SHMCAP. This is just here to show you the basis for the guidance. And as I said before, the guidance is going to point to resilientmass.org as a source for the projections. But here it gives you a screenshot showing you certain climate change projections for the end of the century for Massachusetts, for changes in precipitation in terms of inland flooding and droughts, sea level rise in terms of coastal flooding and erosion, rising temperatures, average rising temperatures, as well as extreme temperatures, and wildflowers, not wildflowers, that would be nice, wildfires and invasive species, and extreme weather events, including hurricanes, tropical storms, nor'easters, etc. We've tried to make the guidance simple where it can be and annotate where it can't be. So this is a schematic that shows that the level of effort for assessing vulnerability should be commensurate with the site sensitivity and risk. So sites with higher vulnerability due to location, the status of the cleanup, the nature and extent of the residual contamination would require more analysis than sites with less sensitivity and risk. Sites without sensitivity factors and or sites where they're being cleaned up to background, would not require further vulnerability assessment analysis. So that was the simple slide, and here's the complex slide. This is not a new flow chart. This is a similar flow chart with a few tweaks to what Ken presented back in January. But all I'd like to highlight here are a few things. If you look on the left side where it says 21E site assessment in MCP, and then you have the pathway down to has background been achieved, yes, and then no substantial climate vulnerability, no further action. So there's the simple site. The middle is where you have to make some decisions about what the status of the site is, what types of risks are there. If you look at the middle box about sensitive populations, environmental resources, contaminant state and transport, et cetera, and making certain decisions about whether those are vulnerable or not. And if the answer is yes, you end up on the right side of the chart. And the right side of the chart evaluates exposure and sensitivity to get at vulnerability of the site. And that's the meat of the checklist that we're going to go through for the rest of the presentation. So the vulnerability checklist, this is the first page of it. The checklist we envision as a tool to provide a broad range of considerations when assessing climate vulnerability at 21E sites, pursuant to the conceptual site model, RAPS, the foreseeable future requirements in the updated regulations. It's divided into 6 sections. We have a section A, which you're seeing here, which is current site conditions. So basically a summary of the general conditions at the site that are most likely to drive risk and other relevant site-specific information about the contamination, about the groundwater or soil category, etc. The section B is initial screening, basically the climate impact risk screening. Section C is exposure considerations based on SHMCAP. Section D are sensitivity considerations, which involves LSP professional judgment. Section E are impacts to groundwater. And Section F would be the conclusion of the checklist. I'm going to turn this over to Marilyn now, and I will keep flipping slides so she can go through these checklists in a little more detail. Marilyn?
Thank you,
Yep.
Susan. Great. And thanks everyone for giving us the opportunity to do this. Yes, so Section A, as Susan said, was, just basic information. All of the information on Section A is something you would have as an LSP collected or ascertained, in the process of doing the phase one. So it should be readily available to the LSPA or to the LSP who's doing the work. This Section B is their vulnerability assessment checklist. And if you think of the flow chart that Susan put up, this is sort of getting at that left-hand side of the chart. It's an initial screening step. It's all questions that have yes and no answers. It's asking you to describe current site conditions and apply, LSP judgment in determining whether, yes or no, any of these things. If the answers are no, when you get through this initial step, then you can stop and just document it in whatever MCP phase report you're submitted at the time, or whatever completion statements you're submitting at the time. And the LSPs can attach the checklist itself if they want to, but it's really just to document that the LSP has considered climate change. And if you get through the no's on this early on checklist, then the depth of your consideration is done, and you can move on from there. So if you find that you really do have to have either site conditions or potential climate impacts that need a little bit of a deeper dive, then you move on to the next section. So Section C is really the exposure assessment. So if you think back to the SHMCAP chart that says vulnerability is a combination of exposure and sensitivity, this is where you're looking at exposure. And you'll see that this mirrors the 4 climate change considerations that are in the SHMCAP, in the state guidance. The SHMCAP is it's not focused just on white site cleanup. It's globally to be used across the state for any kind of project, whether it's expanding an MBTA station or building a bridge over a river or whatever. It's intended through the OEDA to be applied pretty broadly, but we are trying to stick with that framework to stay consistent with what the state direction has been. So sea level rise impacts, extreme weather events, precipitation events, and then other mostly temperature related types of potential impacts that you could see of waste. You may wonder, where you get this information, and there's tons of resources at the end, but the primary source of information for all of this is in Resilient MassDEP. So for example, if you want to know if all or a portion of your site will change from upland to intertidal because of sea level rise, you can go to Resilient MassDEP or find the appropriate figures from the models that are being used by the state and plug it in, and it will show you what the future will look like. Tied to this and sort of the $10,000 question is always, well, what does a foreseeable future look like in terms of number of years? And most of the resources in ResilientMass.org are set up 30 years, 50 years, 80 years out, projecting as much as 100 years out. And that's probably the first thing that where the LSP's judgment has to come in and considering climate change is that they have to select a duration that they're going to look at, because that will determine which model outputs they use to answer this question. So that's exposure considerations. And the these answers are installed in terms of scale, likelihood of impacts to be whether it's low, medium, or high. And some things are not, just not applicable. So for an inland site, the sea level rise ones are all in. So then we have to turn to this site sensitivity, and these are the sensitivity considerations. Again, LSP is to consider things and whether something, in terms of the likelihood, is whether it's a low, medium, or high likelihood of the sensitivity occurring given the site that you're working on. It centers around contaminant fate and transport, whether you have particularly mobile contaminants, whether site characteristics lend themselves to a greater transport or less transport, whether groundwater elevations would change with climate changes, whether there's equipment, building infrastructure at your site, which will be or could be impacted, and whether there is, existing site buildings and facilities, or whether it's equipment or material or buildings that you're constructing as part of your selective permit, and whether there's the ability to adapt the sites to make it more climate resistant. The demographics and site impacts ties, more closely to some risk assessment decisions that LSPs make all the time. But is it next to sensitive receptors? Is it, close to where children and families are? Is it some place where not only increased precipitation, but perhaps, extreme heats are going to create more dust? Is there a dust to drought issue that could affect the community? And then, are you in a location where or ecological impacts could be realized based on climate change? So this is really, again, LSP's judgment based on your specific sites characteristics.
Marilyn, just may I interject just once? I'm having a little trouble hearing you. It might just be my computer,
Oh, I'm
but
sorry.
if you could speak up a little more, or if you have a headset. I don't know if anybody else is having trouble.
Oh, my apologies. Oh, she said something.
That's okay. It might be me.
You know what? I don't. Do a headset.
I think you're on mute now. Now you have to unmute. There you go.
There we go. Is this better?
Oh, that's totally better. Thank you.
Okay. My apologies.
Are we ready for the next slide?
Yep, we're ready for the next slide.
Thank you.
So, and one of the considerations is whether climate impacts, drought conditions, more severe weather events would change the dynamics or the hydrogeologic dynamics at your site. And we've struggled a lot as a committee on how to consider climate change impacts on groundwater. And this is an area where there's not a lot of research or literature out there to help support this kind of assessment work. And so we have come up with a series of questions that are really targeted to the groundwater sensitivity to climate change. But I think probably this section will continue to evolve. But looking at changes in groundwater elevation, changes in direction of flow, changes in the fate and transport of the site-specific contaminants. If you are going to be inundating previously unsaturated soils, having saltwater intrusion, that's going to change the groundwater chemistry, and then whether those changes would have impacts on the effectiveness of groundwater related remedies. Is your chemistry or your saturated thickness or your natural attenuation capacity going to change as a result of the changes in climate. And there's not a lot about this particular aspect of the vulnerability assessment on the resilientmass.org website, but we've been, trying to find and make available whatever other resources we can to help LSPs, do their due diligence in considering these kinds of effects or this level of vulnerability. And then the last section, if you want to go to the next slide, Susan, is really where the LSP reaches a conclusion. I mean, you have rated things as low, medium, or high throughout the prior 3 sections, and to pick the applicable wording, is it likely to be vulnerable? Is it not likely to be vulnerable? And then if your conclusion is that it will be or it is likely to be, then your decision documents and your conceptual site model need to point to any adjustments to the remedy or to the scope of your assessment or to considerations to be made in your phase 3 that could address that level of vulnerability. So again, it is a place where you can reach a final conclusion, help you write up, those sections in whatever MCP deliverables you're working on, and at your option at the LSP's option, we can attach the checklist itself as well. So it's really, this is all meant to very much be a tool to sort of guide LSPs to ask the right questions to get at whether you are working through a site with some vulnerability to the 4 prime climate change impacts. So once you've got through that, I just wanted to go back, and these again were presented by Ken previously, but these are the locations and all the links for the resources that will help you fill out the checklist and help you consider climate change as we're not going to be required to do. Resilientmass.org is the primary resource that we are directing people to. It has the best and most recent science and data on climate change. It is regularly updated. Massachusetts has agreements with the UMass Amherst on the forecasting tools, but there's a large team through EOEA that's working through this. And there's links on there to the SHMCAP, to the Municipal Vulnerability Program for planning. There are interactive maps where you can plug in your site location and get a lot of the information you want to help you with the checklist, and a tutorial on how to use the interactive map. The Resilient Mass Action Team has their own homepage. They're developing climate resilient design standards and guidelines. Again, both the SHMCAP and the RMAT are, statewide across all programs and all departments. But there's valuable information to be found there that is applicable to waste site cleanup as well. And these are all live links. OTA is mapping toxics in communities and looking at climate vulnerability, and they're going to provide maps with various sensitivity layers. So there's a resource that can help you on the sensitivity side of the vulnerability equation. The Sustainable Remediation Forum, or SURF, did climate change and hazardous waste site screening. They went through a lot of the MCP sites and did a whole data analysis of it. This was a one-time shot at it. It's not a forward thinking and it's not, or a forward projecting model, but it does give you some, it's based on FEMA maps, which are of course representative of the history of flooding, not the projected future for flooding. But it does give you a lot of good information, and you can look up individual RTNs in that resource. It's not just Massachusetts centric resources are available. ITRC has a whole sustainable and resilient remediation team. They publish their final guidance at the end of April, and that's what's new since Ken last presented this. You can access the final guidance through ITRC. It's also linked through EPA, and they're going to be doing live webinars starting in July. And you can go to the EPA Clue-In website or to ITRC itself and get on the list to get access to those webinars where they're going to present this final guidance. EPA continues to develop guidance as well at the federal level. There's a Superfund Climate Resilience webpage that's got a lot of the similar information. And then most recently, just this month, EPA published a Climate Smart Brownfields Manual, so intended to help folks going through the brownfields process consider climate change as part of their process. MassDEP did a pilot project. Their information is helpful. There's an organization called First Street Foundation that's did a nationwide assessment looking at America's flood risk. Some very good information on that link as well. And next one. FEMA has the National Risk Index. The CZM is also got their own, model viewer for that they are applying to CZM jurisdictional resources. So if you're working through CZM permitting, you'll come across that as well. And then ASTM has also published a standard guide for remedial action resiliency to climate impacts. And that's also brand new, just recently published. That one's not free, publicly available, but not free. You have to pay for ASTM standards, but that is also out there as well. So our next steps, anticipating that the MCP amendments will be finalized in the fall. Our climate change subcommittee is looking to concurrently finalize the components of our guidance, the Q&A, the flowchart, the glossary, the checklist. We welcome any input that folks want to give us right now. We're trying to since it's a combined LSPA, MassDEP subcommittee, we're trying to engage stakeholders along the way. Our next meeting is Tuesday, June 29th. We meet every other Tuesday for an hour at 8:30. And if you want to join those meetings, it's climate change at lspa.org. We'll go to myself and Wendy and Kathy Rockwell, who's the co-chair of the committee with me, and we can get you out the invitations for the meetings. The meetings are done in Teams. So the group is going to continue to engage with EOEEA and the technical developers working there, including both RMAT and the SHMCAP updates. So lots of federal resources there. And then finally, as Susan mentioned at the beginning, we do have 3 or 4 case studies that are being worked through so that when the guidance comes out with the checklist, we'll also have a few case studies to show how you would walk through the checklist and get to the conclusion statements for a few different types of case study scenarios. So that's it. So climate change at lspa.org if you want to join us and attend the meeting. If you shoot an email there, we can get you out the invite, or Mara can as well. If he gets either one, he will get both emails. So yeah, so that's it. If you want to have any questions for Susan and I.
Okay, first, anybody on the advisory committee like to ask questions? Thank you, Susan and Marilyn, for doing that. We have a question in the Q&A, maybe an observation. With all the focus on climate change, this predictive model will obviously be augmented and updated through time. So 50 to 80 year lookout now will quite likely change, which I think things will be developing in the short term and the long term, I'm sure.
That's true. And I think that's why we are relying heavily on resilientmass.org, because the state's committed to keeping that up to date, and working to keep those models current and the projections QC'd. So, but that's true. Susan?
Right, and that's why also for the guidance, in the guidance, we point to where we expect to find the information, not exactly what the information is, because it is changing and these models will be updated. And whether the LSP chooses to use 2050 as their foreseeable future, or 2070, or the end of the century, would be a judgment call based on a combination of what, for example, resilientmass.org has as projection, what the sensitivity of the site is, what the life cycle of the remedy is. You know, there'll be a lot of, you know, some judgment going into what should that foreseeable future be. But it is a moving target, and that's why we reference reliable sources rather than a data point or a number.
Okay. Duff Collins asks, has the joint LSPA DEP subcommittee made an estimate of the level of effort to work through the checklist process?
We're working on that right now. That's why we wanted to have the case studies. I will say, you know, a simple case study, you know, an oil spill in a less sensitive location that's cleaned up to background is, you know, 10 minutes and done, really. But something that it has, you know, shoreline and salt marsh and wetlands and complicated contaminant mixtures and sensitive populations surrounding it and that kind of stuff, obviously it would take a lot longer. But we're developing case studies with a broad range of site characteristics so that we can test that.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? The attendees in the audience can raise your hands if you like, electronically.